I'd like to introduce a speaker. The title, as you know, is The Trouble with Malaria in Africa. And Professor James Webb is a pioneer in the field of historical epidemiology. His work integrates approaches from the biological sciences and the social sciences to produce perspectives that are useful to historians, practitioners, and planners in the field of global public health. He is the founding editor of two book series at Ohio University Press, Perspectives on Global Health, and the series in Ecology and History. He is currently writing a book on the history of malarial infections and interventions in tropical Africa. So please help me in welcoming Professor Webb.
Well, my thanks to Anwar and the Center for Global Humanities for the invitation to speak tonight. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure, too. My wife has just completed her MPH degree at UNE, and I feel a sense of vicarious pride in her achievement and gratitude toward the School of Public Health, mixed with relief that we have no more tuition payments. So, African malaria is very much in the news these days, and many of you are aware of the efforts to distribute insecticide-treated bed nets to African households, to spray residual synthetic insecticides indoors, to diagnose malarial infections rapidly, and to get therapeutic drugs to people who fall ill. The contemporary campaign to control malaria in tropical Africa has produced impressive results. It's substantially reduced deaths and severe illnesses. The malarial burden, however, is still very high, although no one can be sure of the numbers. Perhaps 600 or 700,000 children die every year, and hundreds of millions who have survived the childhood challenges suffer non-lethal malarial infections. So I'll just refer to the slide here, and I've been informed I should describe it just briefly because this is being taped and is going out over the radio. So here we have a photograph of an Anopheles mosquito, which is the it is the only vector for malaria. And the Anopheles mosquitoes, in case you find one in your house, and we have Anopheles mosquitoes in Maine. If you find one in your house and you see them biting, you will be able to identify them because they have their rear end up in the air when they bite, and that's kind of the distinctive posture of the Anopheles mosquito. This is a map, spatial distribution of Plasmodium falciparum stratified by endemicity class. And this map suggests some of the biophysical parameters of transmission. Most malarial infections in Africa are caused by this Plasmodium falciparum parasite. It's just one of 4 major parasites that cause this disease that we call malaria. And it's the most dangerous of the parasites. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the malarial infections are principally caused by falciparum. It's probably responsible for about 90 or 95% of all of the malarial infections. So this is one reason why malaria in Africa is just really serious. The most globally, widely distributed parasite in the world is not falciparum, it's vivax malaria, which is far less severe as an infection. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's pretty close to 100% falciparum infections. That's one reason why African malaria is kind of a tough problem. Another is that the African mosquitoes, the vectors that carry that transport the parasite, are among the most efficient in the world, which is to say that they accommodate the parasite very well. They don't really get sick when they get infected by the parasite. They tolerate it very well. It goes through its life cycle within the mosquito. And the African mosquitoes are pretty long-lived as well. So this is another reason why transmission is pretty high. Well, in the midst of the contemporary successes, as I've mentioned, significant decreases in the number of deaths, mortality, and the amount of severe illness, there have been some disturbing trends. The number of insecticide-treated bed nets distributed this past year in 2012 is less than 1/2 of the number that were distributed in 2010. The use of insecticides has selected for mosquito resistance, and insecticides in some settings have become less effective in killing mosquitoes. The use of anti-malarial drugs has selected for resistance, and some drugs have become less effective in killing parasites. And donor interest in malaria control is waning. Comparable experiences are documented in the records of the first malaria eradication campaign of the 1950s and 1960s. And the trouble with malaria that I'm going to talk about this evening is that we've been making malaria policy decisions without knowing much about the long and troubled history of malaria control in tropical Africa. Several years ago, when I was writing Humanity's Burden, A Global History of Malaria, I began to investigate the scientific literature on malaria in tropical Africa. I'd assumed that there would be a pretty substantial literature that would allow me to understand the major interventions of the 20th century. To my surprise, there was not. There appeared to be little of an historical nature to investigate. The scientific literature was agreed that tropical Africa had not participated in the World Health Organization's global malaria eradication campaign that ran from 1955 to 1969. On the off chance that there might be more to the African malaria story than had appeared in print, I wrote a letter to the incoming archivist of the World Health Organization. The timing was propitious. The institution had just decided to open its parasitological archives, and I was the first researcher admitted to them. During a preliminary research trip to Geneva, I began to discover elements of an extensive history of malaria control and attempted eradication in tropical Africa that was largely unknown to contemporary malaria specialists. And this slide I'm showing here is the frontispiece of the Afro-Malaria Eradication Yearbook, number 1, 1959, which I discovered completely by accident in about the 3rd month of working through hundreds of boxes of malariological materials in the parasitological archives. There were hundreds of boxes of reports. Initially, I concentrated on gathering data about past interventions in mosquito control, the destruction of mosquito breeding grounds, the killing of mosquito larvae and of adult mosquitoes through the application of natural and synthetic insecticides, and the physical blocking of malaria transmission through bed nets and repellents. I also gathered evidence about past interventions in chemical therapy, both for prophylaxis, to prevent infection, and for cure. And at a later point, I realized that it would be desirable to integrate these lines of investigation in order to understand the impact of interventions on infections. For example, insecticides could and did change the species composition of the mosquito fauna, eliminating some species and opening up ecological niches for others with different vectorial capacities. Some chemical therapies operated differentially on the malaria parasites. and thus changed the mix of malarial infections. At length, I began to realize that African malaria was a dynamic epidemiological and historical problem rather than a constant feature of African life. And I also began to understand more clearly some of the unintended consequences of malaria control. So here is a thumbnail sketch of malaria control in the period of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. In the aftermath of the Second World War, while most of Africa was still under colonial rule, British Empire, French Empire, Portuguese Empire, Belgian Empire, the United States of America pioneered the large-scale use of synthetic insecticides. DDT, to be sure, but also more dangerous chemicals, including dieldrin and benzene hexachloride, and new inexpensive synthetic drugs such as pyrimethamine and chloroquine. DDT in particular promised an inexpensive method of mosquito control, and DDT was considered to be just fabulous. It raised the prospect of effective public health interventions without having to create public health systems. You could just go in and spray. You could solve a major public health problem. You didn't have to set up a public health system. This seemed at the time to be the very essence of public health economy. Enthusiasms ran high. Early programs demonstrated that in urban areas, the new malaria control tools could drive down the number of malarial infections to very low levels. If you went into urban areas and you sprayed DDT, and if DDT didn't work, because in some of the areas in West Africa, the houses were made out of lateritic soils that were sorptive and drew in the DDT, so it didn't have a residual killing action. The interventionists went to other synthetic insecticides, particularly dieldrin and BHC. It was fabulous. You could drop the level of infections by 90%, by 96%, by 98%, by 99%. You just couldn't get to zero. The initial successes in urban areas raised the question, would it be possible to control malaria in rural Africa? In 1950, the first conference on African malaria was held in Kampala, Uganda, where this was the major policy issue. Should the World Health Organization embark upon indoor residual spraying with synthetic insecticides in rural African regions of intense malaria transmission? Africans in these zones who had survived childhood infections had acquired a partial immunity to malaria, and as a result, suffered less severe bouts. The real problem in the 1950s, as today, was among children under the age of 5, when their immune systems were immature and the burden of severe disease and death was concentrated in the under 5 group. If you survived those initial challenges, you could still get sick, but the sicknesses were not very severe. Many people were heavily parasitized. In many areas of tropical Africa, you had what was known as the effective inoculation rate, the number of times you were bit annually by an infected mosquito. And it could be 80 times a year, or 100 times a year, or 800 times a year, or 1,000 times a year. You could receive an infective bite 3 times a day. You could be very heavily parasitized and completely asymptomatic, because your immune system if robust, was able to handle the parasitemia. But the maintenance of this acquired immunity depended upon recurrent inoculations. You had to continually be challenged by infective bites in order to maintain a robust immunological status. So one concern was, well, if efforts to control malaria in rural Africa were launched, and if the interventions were successful, they might compromise Africans' acquired malarial immunities, about which little was known. And if the control efforts were subsequently to fail, the populations that had been protected by the spraying campaigns might lose their immunities and suffer rebound epidemic malaria with severe consequences. So at the heart of this very fractious dispute in Kampala in 1950, at the first conference on African malaria, there were two issues. One was, well, if you believed or if you disbelieved in the possibility of the eradication of malaria. I mean, after all, if you believed that it were possible to eradicate malaria, then the issue of rebound epidemic malaria was moot. It didn't matter. There were many such believers. The second issue was the extent of childhood mortality owing to malarial infections. I mean, how serious was the problem of childhood death and disability? It was surprisingly only in the 1950s that the medical community moved closer to a consensus on the issue of childhood mortality. Childhood morbidity and mortality were conceptualized as costs that were paid to acquire adult and adolescent immunities. If the costs, the medical costs, were high, well, then there was more of an argument for intervention. If, in fact, Africans, young Africans under the age of 5 didn't suffer greatly and managed to acquire immunity, then there wasn't much of an argument for intervention. So in the aftermath of Kampala in the early 1950s, the medical community came to accept an estimate of 25% of childhood mortality, childhood deaths that were directly attributable to malaria. And thus, for those who accepted this estimate, the second of the reasons for caution in malaria intervention dissipated. By virtue of the good that could be conveyed to those in the early years of life through the prevention of malaria transmission, the concern over any potential vulnerability that might be incurred by adults in areas of heavy transmission where the acquired immunities have been compromised through malarial interventions faded away as an issue. This is a slide of the siting of the pilot malaria eradication projects in 1960. Many were supported directly by the World Health Organization. Others were benefiting from assistance from the World Health Organization. Some of you will know that malaria was considered to be the largest global burden of disease at the end of the Second World War. The World Health Organization, at its formation, took up the banner of the League of Nations, which had preceded its health organization in its malaria division. The disease of malaria was the first candidate that was identified for possible elimination, eradication globally, and the first effort to try and eradicate one of the major human diseases was that of malaria, and the campaign built up in the course of the late 1940s and 1950s, and the World Health Organization announced in 1955 that it would go for global eradication of the disease. It was the largest public health program in history. The World Health Organization launched pilot projects in a lot of different ecological zones. They launched them in forest areas, in savanna areas, Sahelian areas, coastal areas, highland zones. It was understood that there was so much variation in transmission in sub-Saharan Africa that any protocols for eradication would have to be worked out on an ecological basis, and that what was going to work in the Sahel was not going to work in a coastal area and was not going to work in a forest area. This is the first of two slides that I'll show from the Liberian campaigns. The Liberian campaigns were the first of the WHO pilot projects. They were the ones that had built upon the interventions of the Americans, who began spraying indoor residual insecticides in 1945. By the mid-1950s, evidence was accumulating that indoor residual spraying, also known as IRS, but not to be confused with the Internal Revenue Service. Evidence was accumulating that indoor residual spraying, or IRS, alone would not be able to interrupt the transmission of malaria. I mean, IRS worked really great. You could kill most mosquitoes. But when you placed heavy selection pressure on the Anopheline mosquitoes, you selected for mosquitoes and for a gene that was resistant to the insecticide. At a World Health Organization technical meeting in 1957, the malaria experts unanimously recommended the initiation of large-scale experiments with the mass administration of anti-malarial drugs. The recommendation, like that with residual spraying, was to try things out, to employ different drugs and different dosage schedules to determine